Ivo Daalder is a former U.S. ambassador to NATO and is president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He joins me from Chicago. Thank you so much, sir, for being here. There's a lot to get through in this Russia-Ukraine standoff. So let me start off with the big picture at the top. What do you think, in your estimation, that Vladimir Putin wants out of this situation?
Well, thanks for having me on. I think what Putin wants most of all is to make sure that he can control the destiny of Ukraine. He is deeply scarred by the end of the Cold War, where he was a KGB officer in East Germany, saw the wall come down in 1989, and ever since has believed that the Soviet Union and Russia have been dealt a bad hand, and he now thinks he has the power to try to reassert Russian control over its immediate neighbors. And that's what this is all really about. It's not about NATO. It's certainly not about a threat that Ukraine poses to Russia. Russia is a nuclear power. Ukraine is not. Russia is the largest military power in Europe, but Ukraine is a relatively small power in Europe. Russia has a seat at the UN Security Council. Ukraine does not. For all those reasons, the real issue is who controls the destiny of Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin wants Moscow to do that rather than Kyiv.
You're making a lot of the same points that Secretary Blinken made in the last hour about NATO and Ukraine, and saying Russia is a great nation, and if it could spend its energies in dealing with some of the challenges of our time, it could be a great nation. But do you think he set the right tone going into the meeting with Sergei Lavrov tomorrow? Because Russia, for instance, insists it wants written responses to its proposals, and the Americans are just not going to do that.
Yeah, the Russian demands really are non-starters, as the United States and frankly, everyone in NATO, all 30 members of NATO last week told the Russian delegation. The issue of who becomes a member of NATO is for NATO and that nation to decide. It's not for Russia to decide. The issue of how NATO protects and defends its members is for NATO to decide. It's not for Russia to decide. That said, if there are serious security concerns that Russia has, whether it is regard to exercises, the deployment of certain weapon systems, the overall level of military capabilities in Europe, the United States has made clear, and NATO has backed this, there is room for negotiation, there's room for diplomacy, there's room for us to sit down and have a serious discussion about security issues. The ball really now is not in NATO's court, it's really in Russia's court. What does Russia want? Does it want to have a serious discussion and a serious effort to negotiate agreements to limit military forces and reduce the risks to security and stability of Europe? Or does Russia want something else, which it cannot and should not have, which is to control the destiny of its neighboring countries, who, after all, are independent, sovereign, and ought to be able to choose their own foreign policies and their own domestic policies?
Ambassador, President Biden said yesterday that Russia would pay a serious and dear price for invading Ukraine. There's also the threat of major economic and financial sanctions that has been made repeatedly, and they're aware of that. Are any of these warnings, do you think, a deterrent?
Well, I would hope so. I would hope that making clear what the costs are of a further Russian aggression against Ukraine, severe economic sanctions that President Biden and others have talked about, the deployment of additional U.S. and NATO troops into Eastern Europe, the very part where Vladimir Putin would like to see troops depart from, and importantly, a much stronger commitment among Ukrainians to become part of the West. After all, it's good to remember that before 2014, before Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, there was a mixed picture within the popular position, the population's view on whether or not to join NATO. It's only after Russia attacked Ukraine that the Ukrainians really en masse became interested in joining the West and joining the European Union and NATO. So that too is something that would come about if Russia were to attack. In short, the best way forward here is to have a diplomatic course. I think it's a good idea for the United States and Russia to meet in Geneva, and we hope that those are the beginnings of talks that deal with real security issues rather than trying to undermine the sovereignty of an independent country in the middle of Europe.
I'd love to hear your reaction, Ambassador, to comments from President Macron today at the European Union that the European Union must act independently to guarantee security in Europe, especially in light of that Russian aggression we've been talking about. Listen.
These next few weeks must lead us to bring to fruition a European proposal to build a new order of security and stability.
Nous devons le construire entre
We
Européens.
must build it among Europeans, then share it with our allies within the framework of NATO, and then propose it to Russia for negotiation.
Proposer à la négociation à la Russie.
Sir.
This crisis has been going on for quite a while, and I'm a little surprised that the French president is saying that in the coming weeks Europe needs to build a proposal. I'd be interested to see what is that proposal? How does it differ from what the United States is putting forward, and what NATO has been discussing for the past few months? I think at this point the most important thing to happen is for Europe, the United States, to stand together as one as we deal with a threat, a major threat, as Secretary Blinken in his speech in Berlin put it, to the European security order. We're better off standing together than trying to divide each other and saying one organization is more important than the other. What's really important is that we're all in this together and have to make clear to the Russians that invading another country in Europe is just not acceptable.
Ambassador Ivadalta, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.